I couldn't feel anything. My hands were completely numb suddenly, and I just started getting flooded and having flashbacks and dissociating, and I didn't know about these things. No one had prepared me for these things, and it was overwhelming, of course. And through that, I learned about somatic psychotherapy because it was so obvious to me how much the body is a part of the persistence of trauma when we haven't been able to heal.
Welcome to Erase PTSD Now, the podcast, erasing the silence. Here we bring trauma out of the shadows and into the conversation. You'll hear real stories, survivors, veterans, clinicians, researchers. Together we'll explore the healing treatment and the science behind the stellate ganglion block. This isn't just another podcast. It's a movement, and one that demystifies trauma, elevates unheard voices, and inspires action.
Welcome back to the Erase PTSD Now podcast, where we have honest conversations about trauma, healing, resilience, and many paths people take towards reclaiming their lives. Today's guest is Erika Shershun, a somatic psychotherapist, author, and trauma specialist who has dedicated her work to helping survivors reconnect with safety, resilience, and empowerment. Erika specializes in supporting survivors of sexual trauma through an integrative and trauma-informed approach that combines therapy, EDMR, brain spotting, just everything. You're going to learn more about this today. Erika, please tell us about yourself.
Oh, well, first of all, thank you, Colleen, for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to your audience. And yeah, I'm a survivor of sexual trauma. And so through my own journey to heal, which took years and years because I wasn't getting the work I needed, I developed the work I needed to heal through, combining many different approaches and modalities, and finally did heal from PTSD resulting from these traumas. Around the same time, I started attracting a lot of survivor clients into my practice and started using the same techniques with them. And that led to my books, the Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook and the Healing Sexual Trauma Guided Journal, as well as my course for practitioners and the book I'm currently writing for practitioners. So those are both through PESI, and that's, I guess, brings us up to now.
Well, and that's a lot to unpack. So through this, you found a silver lining, so to speak, and thank you for that. And I'm glad you're here today, and I'm glad that you're able to share your story and to help so many others. So you were mentioning that you realized that there was a disconnect with what you were getting to recover, and you combined all these different components. Can you tell us about all those different components? And again, thank you for sharing your journey and this information with us.
Oh, you're so welcome. So, what it started it off for me was having symptoms intensify. 17 years into therapy, while doing a body work training. So I was a massage therapist at the time, and I was taking a trigger point therapy training, which is very, very subtle work. And after the instructor asked me to demonstrate on some work on the neck, and I wanted to, but the word no came out of my mouth. And someone else got up and demonstrated, and they ended up having a similar life-threatening assault on themselves, although theirs wasn't a sexual trauma. I just went back to do what he had just shown us, taught us, and I couldn't feel anything. My hands were completely numb suddenly, and I just started getting flooded and having flashbacks and dissociating, and I didn't know about these things. That far into therapy, no one had prepared me for these things, and it was overwhelming, of course. And through that, I learned about somatic psychotherapy because it was so obvious to me how much the body is a part of the persistence of trauma when we haven't been able to heal.
Will you explain a little why and I don't mean to interrupt you, but just because we're touching on something that we haven't before, can you explain that a little more what that is?
So, somatic psychotherapy works with the body as well as the emotions and the thoughts. We're working with all of it as a whole integrated being because the emotions can be preceded by sensations and even thoughts can. Like, we don't always think something and then feel something. In other words, we feel these things arising in our body, these patterns of movement and being that need to be addressed as part of the healing. So, for instance, the nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, when we detect danger, which can be a thought, even though there isn't a real danger, a fearful thought, or it can be detecting it in other ways, not only thoughts. We immediately will go into either fight, flight, or freeze if the nervous system determines that the threat is at that level. So this is happening in the body before we can make a decision about what we want to do. We don't choose to freeze. It happens to us, but it's happening always in, the goal is survival of the body. It's always survival. So it's happening for a reason, but we're not necessarily needing it at that time. So we have to work with the body as well as the thoughts because of that and many, patterns that have been developed since often since infancy of constricting, you know, pulling away or so. In any case, does that answer your question?
It does, and it does explain, because many people might not be aware of this, or certainly a combo of it. But please go on with explaining how you combine the therapies.
So the somatic work alone that well, what happened next was I went back to school and enrolled in grad school in somatic therapy program, and I still wasn't healed or healing. I mean, I thought I had gotten further along by the time I started the program, but the symptoms were still quite intense, and I was having flashbacks while in classes and being triggered very easily. So, by bringing in other things like energy work, some things from traditional Chinese medicine, and also other modalities that weren't being taught in the program that were specific to helping trauma and somatic base, just because graduate programs don't have a lot of time to devote to trauma and it's just not enough what people are taught. So therapists need to take a lot of extra time and money investing in learning more than what they get in grad school to work with trauma. So
And I don't mean to cut you off there, but that's an interesting thing to have realized too, that there's a disconnect with what the actual needs are for probably the roots of the problems is getting to the root of the trauma. So that's very interesting that you say that.
yes, that came as a big surprise to me. I didn't know that going into the program, so I try to let people know that are entering into those programs to get started on some of or one of these trainings if they're able to even before they enter into a program. It will give them a big head start. It's really a disservice that the programs don't focus more on healing from trauma. I had one class in 3 years of grad school, and my program was longer than most because of it being somatic. So it has that component in addition to everything else people going through these programs are learning. So even in a 3-year program, I had one course devoted to trauma healing, and it's just not enough.
That is, it is a disconnect with what the need is. And most people are going into some sort of therapy that has to do with the trauma being the root cause of it. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
I mean, why how could it not be?
Yeah, in my opinion, every therapist should be trained in working with trauma. Unfortunately, a lot of them are not, or, very minimally.
These are things that I'm serious. I've never actually thought about that it's not taught there. You think that you're getting everything. You think that you were getting everything that you needed, but then there's thankfully there's people like you sharing that information. So now let's look at the so what role do you think mindfulness or grounding play into the nervous system healing? Because you've looked at that sort of thing as well, correct?
Yes, those are both a part of what I include in my work, and you have to start out with resources to help someone begin to feel safe enough to do the work, and grounding's a part of that. Orienting is a huge part of that as well. So, we have to know our surroundings in the present moment are safe enough to do the work of healing. And it starts outside of us. And then we go inward to the body. The grounding really helps the inward piece of it. But, we have to start with the orienting and the grounding. And then mindfulness is so important as well. By practicing all of these things, all three of these things, we help start to create new neural pathways and networks, and strengthen all of that to change the pattern of going into a fear response when we don't need to. So it's by in part by practicing these things over and over again that we start to change.
And then why do you think that trauma tends to live in the body long after the experience is over? Because you mentioned that it's you got to start on the outside then the inside. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, when our system is overwhelmed by an event, which is what causes trauma, when that happens, the memory is not stored in the same way as it is when we are having a experience that is pleasant or neutral, or even, an uncomfortable experience, but it doesn't rise to the level of trauma for our system. So when our system is completely overwhelmed, we remember much of it implicitly. So we're remembering through sensations and through procedural memory, which includes sensations, but it's also patterns of movement and other types of things. And we're also remembering emotionally. So these things then get triggered is, the word we commonly use, but something can show up and our body, well, let me just give an example. Like there could be something that was present at the time of the traumatic event. Like for instance, a fan was on in the room, and then the survivor goes over to, a friend's house, and they have a fan on, and all of a sudden they're dysregulated, and they might not know why. They may have made the connection with the fan, or they may not have. I mean, it can be anything. It can be a smell, it can be someone's expression, someone's gestures, even someone's features that remind the survivor of the person who betrayed them. So there are so many things that can bring up these memories and these implicit memories and, bring on the symptoms. So in what I was telling earlier, the demo at the class I was in, it was the teacher working on the neck, and then to make matters worse, this person having been through something similar that threw me into flashbacks and dissociation.
And now at that point did you realize what was happening to yourself?
I didn't realize what was happening at first because I was so unfamiliar with these things. I'd probably been dissociating for years without knowing it, but, this was before social media. This all wasn't such public knowledge as it is now. So I was really overwhelmed not knowing what was happening to me, but the flashbacks started, and so I did start to have, in this case, so flashbacks are not always visual, but in this case, I did start to have some visual and also a lot of sensory. So I made the connection pretty quickly once the flashbacks started to, what it was. But when they started, it brought up a series of traumas, not just one trauma. So, a lot was coming up, and, it's quite painful to go through. I really have a lot of empathy for survivors who are dealing with flashbacks, and not all trauma survivors have flashbacks, but it's quite challenging for those who do. But through the work I do, they don't last long when they have them. We usually move through them in at most 3 months, sometimes less, often less.
I do think that there's part of I don't know this, but I do know that they do teach massage therapists now that if there's a neck injury, certain maneuvers they cannot do. But I said neck injury, I don't mean that. If there was trauma that involved, then they can't do certain motions that it'll trigger. I I believe because a massage therapist was very, very concerned about doing that.
The thing is anything can trigger.
Right.
So, it's so unique to each person's story, what exactly happened to them, and a lot of times people don't remember because they were so young when the trauma happened, or because they were so dissociated when the trauma happened, and the memory recall just, doesn't work the same way. But when I'm doing EMDR, the story unfolds through the somatic symptoms that are coming up and the emotions that are coming up as we go through it. So it becomes pretty clear. Sometimes I work with people who, because they can't remember much, they doubt in ways their own knowing, or they don't feel they know. So there's a lot of, it just adds to the shame. Like, am I even legitimately a survivor type of feelings, which is, really heartbreaking. But as we go through it, they see how much their body remembers, and it tends to be enough to validate to them that no, this is real. Like, your body isn't making these things up. You really couldn't fake it, you know. Like, and why anyone would want to is beyond me, but it's pretty amazing. It's how it unravels during EMDR.
I mean, and knowing all this and putting it all together for each victim's or trauma victim's own personal journey is pretty incredible. You have an additional insight. So, what have you found happens when healing moves beyond just talking about the trauma and begins involving the nervous system and body directly?
Well, that's when integration starts to take place. Then I also really prioritize memory reconsolidation and releasing trapped emotions. I think those three things are needed to fully heal. And what happens then is that the person is freed up to be a fuller expression of their authentic self. They don't have all these defenses showing up that relate to the trauma. They're not avoiding things that remind them of the trauma. They're able to live a fuller life where they feel much freer. And yeah, it's a beautiful thing to see. It really, I feel quite privileged to witness this healing.
As you should, because that is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
So, you mentioned this. There's self blame and shame, and then you help people rebuild their self compassion after trauma with this process, don't you?
During it, actually, yeah. That's another big piece that comes in is early on in the work is teaching people how to create a self-compassion practice and why it's important, and often there's things in the way that have made it really hard for them to connect with self-compassion. So sometimes it can be a few months before they can even take it in. We always get there. It's possible even for someone who can't take it in at all in the beginning. It's just, again, like, practice, and, it's also I mentioned releasing trapped emotions. That helps quite a bit with it because somatically, that looks like constricting around the heart center. Energetically, it's like little balls of energy that emotions from an event that weren't able to be processed or trapped in that area. So as we release those trapped emotions, they start to free up. Another part of my healing early on, very early on, was probably around the time of not long after the story I told earlier with the neck. But I was on a massage table and I was in the midst of getting a chiropractic adjustment. However, he was working on someone else when this happened, but I had this visual of my heart, but there was this dark shield around it. It was an inverted egg shaped shield and it was like rock, but it had cracks in it, and there were some little pieces that had fallen off, and it was as though there was a baby bird inside chipping away, trying to get out, and where the pieces had fallen off, there was a golden light shining through, just this luminous light, and it was a beautiful message at the time because it gave me hope, and it was like, I understood this shield developed to try to protect me, but it isn't serving me now, and it is breaking away, and that it was validation that I was healing.
That is very powerful. So this is you coming putting all these different things together and
Mhm.
realizing this all-encompassed treatment for people. So when you're looking at this, the way that you've discovered this best probably the best practice for dealing with all the components and the intensity, how long does it take most people? You sort of touched on that for some, but how long would somebody expect to be going through this? Because of course we all want it tomorrow. So what's that look like? I know
So,
everybody's unique.
yeah, we can no one can ever tell you exactly how long it's gonna take for you. However, I've observed through working with hundreds of clients that, if it's a one-time trauma, a big trauma, for instance, a sexual trauma, and the person has otherwise had a pretty stable life with a lot of support, emotional support, then it only takes a year or less to clear it up, and often less. And then if it's someone who's had many traumas, so it's called complex PTSD when people have had a series of one traumatic event after another in their childhood, and then often it continues into adulthood. It can take up to 3 years. It's not usually more than that, but most commonly, people work with me 1 to 2 years, and they're happy with where they're at that point.
A lot of good information, Erica. Thank you. Um, okay, so we always like to ask this question to everybody, and it's the first step to erasing the silence around trauma is
It's understanding that unhealed trauma cuts us off from the full expression of ourselves by keeping us in survival response for much of the time, where safety, play, creativity, and authentic connection are hard, if not impossible, to access. And at the same time, receiving kind and unconditional love helps create a sense of safety and acceptance, invaluable to the healing process.
Wow, that's a big step. Thank you for that insight. Now, I think you have a lot of projects that are going on. Would you like to talk about some of those?
Well, I have 2 books that are available, the Healing Sexual Trauma Workbook, and if anyone is to look for that, please make sure it's mine because two people copied the title after this one, so there has been a little confusion. So it's somatic skills to help you feel safe in your body, create boundaries, and live with resilience. And a lot of people use this in their therapy. So there are therapists who introduce it, and then there are clients who bring it in. And then the same can be done with this one, where the clients can work on this and bring it in to help them get through the work. This is pretty gentle though. So this is the Healing Sexual Trauma Guided Journal. And then I have the PESI course for practitioners. And I also am writing a book now for practitioners that will be released next year through PESI, PESI.
Wow, thank you. All right, now going back to the journals that you had there, do you find that the people do them on their own, or is it better when they're doing them with their therapist, or how do you see those best utilized?
So I wrote both books. I did the workbook first, but I wrote both of them to be available for people who didn't have access to therapy, as well as people who do. But because of my own struggle to heal, I really didn't want others to be going through that. And a lot of people do find their way to me who have had similar stories, who've been struggling to heal for years. And, it's extremely expensive also and time consuming. People get quite frustrated, and I can understand why some people end up giving up, which, I don't recommend at all. But if they can't find the right resources, it can lead to that. So if someone can't find or afford therapy, there are also the low fee clinics in case people aren't aware of that. And, if you have a university where you live that has a psychology program, they have low fee clinics. So getting the workbook and bringing it in because your therapist might not have training in this can help both you and the therapist to go through it. So it's just extra support if you do have the therapy as you work through it, so you're not completely on your own in it. However, even if you are completely on your own in it, it will help tremendously. Just go slow. Don't rush through it and do the practices. Try the practices. The healing doesn't happen just through reading about it. You've got to embody it.
That's good. That's another good point.
And you'd asked about the journal. So the journal followed because my publisher asked me to write a journal. And if you are doing it on your own, I would recommend going with the journal because it just flows from one thing to the next. There are not as many different practices, so it's easier to understand what to prioritize. And in the workbook, there's a lot to choose from because everyone's different. So wanted to give options, but the journal, I really prioritized what you've got to focus on. So I would recommend the journal if you are healing on your own.
Good, that's good. And you could get it on Amazon, did you say?
Yeah, I didn't say, but you can get it on Amazon or at a lot of the independent bookstores. Just is all the big booksellers. They're also in 5 other languages, so you can find them in you can find the workbook in Spanish, and now it's out in, Romanian and
Oh, wow.
Russian and in Polish. The guided journal is being released in Turkish.
That is quite Look at you. So there's a lot you learned on your healing journey, and you're really just you're sharing it. And not everybody knows you're out there, but you sure have a method that is different than many, with a distinct understanding to what the victim is going through, which is incredibly valuable. So I'm happy to see what sort of feedback we get, and then come back and let you share more, because you touch on so many different things that we haven't touched on in previous podcasts and conversations, just about the different techniques that you use for the all-encompassed healing. And then the other thing, I know that people will be like, "Oh, here, I don't have a year, I don't have the money for a year." We can look at those aspects too on a second part, maybe down the road a little bit.
Yeah, maybe I should say, because, if you don't have a year, then you're living with it for the rest of your life.
Exactly.
How can you not have a year when you've lived year after year with it? Like, you know what I mean? A year is nothing compared to however long you've lived with it, or it just happened, but the symptoms are gonna get worse and worse. Like, that's something we didn't talk about, is all the symptoms that can show up.
How can people find you, Erica?
They can find me at healingsexualtrauma.com, which is, my books, and also a blog for healing sexual trauma. And they could download the first chapter of the workbook for free. And there is a exercise that will get them started on their healing journey at the end of that chapter. And preceding it, I talk about why we do each part of the exercise. So there's some other exercises embedded in that. So there's a lot in that chapter around safety and establishing safety or relative safety as they begin their healing. And then they can also find me at Erika Shershun therapy.com if they're interested in therapy. And I work as a licensed therapist in California and as a coach outside of California.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Colleen, for having me on today. It's really been an honor to speak with you and your audience.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Erase PTSD Now, the podcast. If you've been affected by trauma, love someone who has, or want to be a part of real change, this space is for you. New episodes drop every third Wednesday. Follow Erase PTSD Now so you never miss an episode, and join us in the fight to erase PTSD.